large amounts of government resources and international development aid are dedicated to education. Yet in many developing countries, educational attainment remains low. So this raises the question whether not only lack of resources for education, but also inefficient allocation of existing resources within education systems in those countries is holding back education. In my job market paper, I study the allocation of one key resource, teachers, and I examine how the distribution of teachers across public primary schools affects educational outcomes. Now, we know that pupil-teacher ratios are much higher in low-income countries. But what I show in my paper is that within low-income countries, you actually have some schools with pupil-teacher ratios that are as low as in many rich countries, and you have other schools where pupil-teacher ratios are much higher. For example, in the US, basically every public primary school has a pupil-teacher ratio between 10 and 25. In India, also 30% of public primary school students attend schools with pupil-teacher ratios in that same range. But at the same time, you have 10% of students that go to schools with pupil-teacher ratios above 80. So in other words, there's simply much more variation in pupil-teacher ratios across schools in low-income countries. This is certainly a concern from an equity point of view, but what I try to understand in my paper is whether it's also a concern from an efficiency point of view. So in other words, would or could aggregate educational attainment be improved in developing countries by allocating teachers differently across public primary schools? And I approach this question in two steps. So first, I portray some new stylized fact about the distribution of teachers across schools in developing and developed countries, which suggests that there may be misallocation of teachers across schools in poor countries. So for example, I find that variation in pupil-teacher ratios is negatively correlated with educational outcomes, even once you control for differences in income, population, and aggregate pupil-teacher ratios, both across countries and across districts within countries, thus suggesting that there could be benefits to allocating teachers more equally across schools. In the second part of the paper, then, I write down a stylized model of teacher allocation, which I simulate in order to understand what the effects of alternative teacher distributions would be on educational outcomes. And my model projections suggest that gains from reallocation would be substantial in low-income countries, but basically zero in high-income countries. So overall, this is really suggesting that there is misallocation of teachers and probably educational resources more generally in developing countries, and this is holding back education.